decided liking them this year. And I'm actually going to show you this question a little bit. I thought this was a really good question to give you two short examples about the Revolutionary War. And I'll give you this example. So I'm going to hand this out to you again. But then some specific things that you have to add to it from the Revolutionary War. And actually, that was a good question. Almost everyone did this one. And then the next one from last year was this wonderful thing. A nauseating job. Remember the muckrakers and the progressives and Teddy Roosevelt? That's what this one is. And so here he is going through, did you catch it? Meat scandal. Remember the jungle? That's what this one's about. And last year, everyone had to do this one. And this was one, they liked it, who got it, but some people didn't see the meat scandal. You know, they saw this and got confused. And so make sure you look through the whole cartoon. Meat scandal. Oh, okay, the jungle, then the Food and Drug Act, the Meat Inspection Act. Those are the kind of things. And that's basically the question. Perspective about the government, or one perspective expressed by the artist about the role of government in society. And remember the progressive ideal, that's regulation. You know, that's the big thing. Once regulation, government must have some interaction with the economy. I found one event or development historical situation. That could be a lot, but the one I would think of immediately would be the jungle. And most people answer that, put down the jungle. Is that what most focus specialists the jungle? And name one specific outcome of the progressive era debates about the role of government in society. And so something about, remember, laissez-faire, capitalism versus regulation. Something about the different regulations of the progressive era. Yeah.
So when they say briefly, that's like a short idea.
Yeah, that's 3-sentence short idea. So you have 1 3-sentence, 1 3-sentence, 1 3-sentence. You don't need a topic sentence. You don't need a thesis. You just answer. You want to grab that desk out there if you want. If we need more, we'll get more. I come when you come. I understand that. So you have 3 of these to do. That's a total of 9 3-sentence short IDs. Let me give another one from last year. This was a choice. This one was a choice. So it was briefly describe one historical difference between the role of religion in Spanish colonization and colonization of New England. Basically what they're talking about there is Catholicism versus Puritans. Briefly describe one historical similarity between the role of religion in Spanish colonization, and so they want 2. And so something about, I almost no one answered this question in my class because we didn't get a chance to talk much about the role of religion. But the big one about that one would be that the Spaniards tried to force the American Indians who lived in their areas to revolt, and that would lead to things like the Santa Fe Revolt, the Pueblo Rebellion, the 17th century, where the Puritans, they used religion as an excuse to conquer and take over. And lastly, one historic effect of religion on development society in the Spanish colonies or New England colonies. And so it could be something to the effect of King Philip's War or the Pueblo Revolt, or those kind of things. Almost no one answered this one. They had a choice between this one and this one. One specific historical difference between the internal migration patterns in the U.S. states between 1910 and 1940, and internal migration patterns from 1941 to 1980. That's specifically answered. Remember the Great Migration of America, and then what I was going to talk about it tomorrow or Tuesday. But there was a migration from people in the north to the so-called Sun Belt. The big thing about that was, and I mentioned it kind of in passing on the tangent, with something to the effect of air conditioning, and more people started moving to the south. So that's the 2 biggies. And historical impact, one of the biggies, the one that almost everyone who answered this talked about, would be the Civil Rights Movement. That Northerners, and there might have been blacks who moved to the north, were segregated, but without a doubt, they could vote, and that gave them more power, and that would help fuel the Civil Rights Movement in the 50s and 60s. So those are the 3 from last year. Here's the DBQ from last year. So they go through the basic elements of it, but then it's right here. The relative importance of different causes for the expanding role of the United States in the world from 1865 to 1910. That's imperialism, big stick diplomacy, the Spanish-American War, economic imperialism in Latin America, you know, the Panama Canal, and then like the Platinum and the Power Amendment. That's what it's talking about there. And most of them like that. Most of them like that. But after 1865, remember I mentioned Alaska? The United States bought Alaska in 1867, and then opened up Japan and more trade with Japan, and that could also add it to now that's going over Japan, and then like the Boxer Rebellion. All those things sound familiar? Yeah, they like that question. And last year's class, I don't get much, but I get just kind of a basic where they fit. They did really well on this one. Really well. A lot of good documents. And lastly, you want to see it? 3 choices for the essay. The commercial exchange system such as mercantilism, a good little mercantilism essay question, and that would go all the way up to all the British Trading Navigation Acts, the various laws after this French and Indian War, to revolution, you could argue. The extent which Civil War fostered change in the U.S. economy from the period 1861 to 1900, that's the second industrial revolution. All the issues of that with corporations and the beast. That sound familiar? That's what it's asking about. They split pretty evenly, and scientific or technological innovation that changed the United States economy in 1950, or 2000. And so everything from the technology revolution in the 80s and 90s, the computer revolution started in the 1970s, and then things like cars, TVs, and some people mentioned air conditioning because that contributed to the migration to the Sun Belt. Those are all pretty good questions. Now, if you go to my webpage, I've mentioned this before, I know a lot of you have gone to my webpage, but there's a lot of information on there, including a picture of Ed Podolak, but also Ed Podolak. I can't tell you how many people had said that, I didn't know you had a mustache. I'm not that cool. Oh, wrong one. So, if you go hit the AP test review, this has all kinds of information. I know a lot of you have looked at this already. I've talked to people who have looked at tech. There's some Quizlets, there's exam questions the last couple of years, all kinds of stuff. And I know a lot of you have looked at all kinds of note packets. I thought that was a funny picture. And then there's just a significant amount of stuff on that. Con stuff's kind of cheesy, but it's quick. And some decent practice tests. Some are like this. It's just an online test. Some, I think I have a PDF of practice tests. I'm going to take another practice test. So all that stuff's on there in the Partridge post. I know a lot of you looked at it, and I've told you keep looking at it. Check my website, but this one, so practice mode, and it. So it just says it's a little girl working. That's child labor laws. That's government. Does that make sense? Yeah, so you can go check all those out. I have more, but I've also can give you other practice tests. But I thought that was a good thing to look at, but I just wanted to show you that real quick. And so I don't want that out anymore. It's hot. So all those out there, but I will give you that other practice test. So let's go ahead and I go and take out your review packet, and I will answer any questions, but I'll also give you a few other things. Oh, does everyone have? Why did I shut the light? Does everyone have this? I'm not, you don't need it right now, but if everyone get this review list, yeah, you did not get this. This is a good little thing where you go through, and those are basic things of potential for questions. And you can brainstorm 10 or 15 things. You know you're good in that area. If you can't, oh, you don't need one too. Each round one time. Yeah. They're underneath. That's good. The one at the very top. Now you're sliding them all up. Oh, we need a bunch of them? How come we only have 2? I really meant to do that. And it worked better than I thought. I'll make it another copy. I promise I'll make it. Just remind me, I'll make it. I know I get other ones, but I think Gabby did them all. I'm blaming you. Okay, yes. That's the review book. The review book, no, chapters 30 and 31 to that last section.
Okay.
So, just to review for tomorrow, we're going to do a quick brainstorm, outlining thesis of the colonial economic differences. And the other thing is, I will do a quick, and then at lunch, I will go through the 80s and 90s. I'll cover everything I can to get as much of that as I humanly can get done. And so I'll help you out immensely if you are not 100% ready for that. So go and take that out now, and let's start going through. I will go over, like I said, as much as I could go over. Okay, so are there any questions? First up, let's start going through the list, and then I will go through some particular ones. And I'll go through a lot, and this really does help, in case, especially if you only got partial answers or you look someplace else. So, any questions on anything we find? Now, I'm going to go. Let's go for right now. Let's go. I said I'll go anywhere up to 1920. And so, why don't we start with period 3? So, period 3 is about 1754. There will be the DBQ will be after this 1754. The vast majority of questions on the AP exam will be 1754 to about 1970. The vast majority. 2 of the short answer questions will be in this period, and we'll give you one choice from the other periods, and that's nice. And of the essay questions, at least 2 of them should be in this period. 2 of your 3 choices. So this is a nice, a good area. It's what we cover the most in class, and that's why. What's your question?
Tariff and Hamilton.
Tariff and Hamilton, that's on page 16. And so Tariff and Hamilton, what page is it on? 3. Tariff and Hamilton. Hamilton wrote a pamphlet called the Report on Manufacturers. Everyone find it? The Report on Manufacturers, where he laid out the idea that the United States should become an industrial power, copy and break. And so what he wanted were large, high protective tariffs that would drive competition up. Remember, tariffs raise all prices, but especially the prices of foreign competitors. The Republicans were opposed because it would raise prices for farmers who don't manufacture goods. So this one did not pass. Only a small revenue tariff would pass. But the tariff battle would go on between those who want high protective tariffs and those who don't. Those who want high protective tariffs will be called protectorists, and those who don't will be called free traders, who don't want protective tariffs. Good question, and that's one of the 3 big things for Hamilton and the beginning of the Federalist Party: the bank, assumption bill, and tariffs. Those are like the 3 biggies. And then on the side, Britain and the hatred of Britain, which we all agree with, right? Yes, another one. Anyone other in section 3 do we have? Yes, go ahead.
British debt.
Okay, British debt, and that's the debt after the French and Indian War. And that's on page 2, or is that 3?
2.
And that's after the French and Indian War. They issued all the bonds to pay back for the war. And that would lead to them, after the French and Indian War, to enforce mercantilism. Those laws like the Stamp Act, the Townshend Act, and the Tea Act would be the 3 biggies. And that would lead directly to the American Revolution. The big thing is they want to enforce mercantilism, so it ties in. But the debt after the wars, especially the French and Indian War. Is there another one? Yes?
On page 3, the Treaty of Greenville.
The Treaty of Greenville?
Yeah.
Okay, that was in 1794, and that was one of the, I have no American map I was going to point to. Just imagine I'm pointing at Ohio. So that was after a confederacy of tribes of the Ohio region were defeated at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. And after fallen timbers, the United States enforced a treaty where the US got most of Ohio forever. And the rest of the old Northwest, that would go to the various tribes forever. And forever lasted about 2 to 3 seconds until the United States started violating that treaty. And that would begin the steps where the US would try to get more and more of that land that would lead you to Tecumseh and the Battle of Tippecanoe. And that's weird, because Treaty of Grenville was in that period, and that's one of the things why I don't like breaking up the periods, but I do it just because it's because 1794 is directly tied to 1811, but they just put an arbitrary date. So yes.
The Kentucky and Virginia resolutions.
So that was done in opposition to the Alien and Sedition Acts. They said the Sedition Acts was violating the First Amendment. And they were written by Jefferson and Madison. Jefferson, Kentucky, Madison, Virginia. And it said that states could nullify unconstitutional laws. State could nullify unconstitutional laws. Now, fortunately, the quasi-war, which started the whole thing, ended before they could actually nullify it. But that would be used as a foundation for eventually the nullification crisis in 1833 and then secession in 1860, 61. So that states are sovereign. That's the biggie. There's nothing, it wasn't clear in the Constitution who would decide constitutionality. That's why in period 4 I have McCulloch versus Maryland. Not McCulloch versus Maryland, Barber versus Madison. I believe I do. Yeah, that's the one on the top of page 4. I'm connecting them, watch well. The top of page 4. And the big thing about that one, the Supreme Court gave itself the power of judicial review.
That's
Marbury versus Madison. They gave themselves the power to decide the constitutionality of laws because it's not in the Constitution. And this is a big deal because the Supreme Court just said, we have this power. And it's never been clear, but it's interesting. It might be unconstitutional for them to decide the constitutionality of laws, but there's no way to decide if it's constitutional because they decide the constitutionality of laws. It's a circle. Any others? Yes.
The growth of parties, Federalists and Republicans.
Yeah, so that's on page 3. Yeah, the first 2 political parties, and the big thing is they started with. So the growth of parties started with those 3 ones out on top. I had the Assumption Bill, the Bus, and the Tariff. And so the growth of parties is going to be the Federalists would be the ones who are going to be more urban, commercial, want industry. And so they want government. They want government to promote industry with things like the bank. So you can kind of look up above. Things like Assumption Bill. Things like the Tariff. They want direct government aid for business. They were also pro-British in the French Revolutionary Wars. They were pro-British in that one. And they were led mostly by Alexander Hamilton. That's the one we need to know. It's kind of the ideological founder. And they are relatively anti anything like a democracy. They are very elitist. The Republican Party, which will be led by Jefferson and Madison, and others, but we just got to narrow it down. And they're going to be promoting more rural interests. They fear urban centers because there'll be centers of finance and banking. Farmers hate banks because they're always in debt. And they oppose government action to promote industry. They consider most government action will promote industry and promote monopolies, so they wanted a weaker central government. And they've supported the French. I should add one more thing I forgot. When the Federalists were in power, they wanted a very loose interpretation of the Constitution. Remember that term, implied powers? They wanted a loose interpretation. The Republicans, while they were out of office, wanted stronger state government, strict interpretation of the Constitution. Strict interpretation. Until, of course, you had a Republican president. But that should be a big one, and that should cover that. I always think that'd be a great essay question. There hasn't been one on that for a long time. Either that one or the Whigs or the Republicans. It just seems like they would be really good ones. or at least a short answer question or something. Of course, now that they said that, we just went over it, it won't happen, I'm sorry, but. Is there another one? Yeah.
Republican womanhood.
Republican woman. I think I said this at lunch the other day, but just real quick, is the idea of a new Republican society created after the Declaration of Independence, that the role of women will be to teach young men to be good citizens in a republic. So when Abigail Adams tried to get her husband, co-writer, John Adams, co-writer of the Declaration of Independence, what about the women? Said, oh, you got a job. Your job is to teach men to be good citizens, and to teach women to teach men. And it fits in directly with the cult of domesticity, that women will be the moral foundation of the society. Any others? We good on section 4.3? We're done?
Yorktown.
Huh?
Yorktown.
Yorktown, the last battle of the Revolutionary War. The British under Cornwallis were surrounded near Jamestown, on that James Peninsula at Yorktown. And the big reason the United States won is because the French fleet cut off the British. So with French aid. So the big thing about Yorktown is with French aid, that would eventually lead to the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The British realized it's not worth it anymore. Yeah, it's one of the great ironies. Washington actually had more French troops under his command than American troops. So French aid. Is there another one? Yes.
Pontiacs War, 1763.
Yeah, Pontiacs War was after the French and Indian War just ended, and it was the tribes of the Old Northwest, and they attacked almost all the British forts in the Old Northwest, fearful of colonial settlement in their area. And the British, who didn't want another war, remember they had that debt, it would lead directly to the Proclamation of 1763. You know what the Proclamation of 1763 was? No colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, which infuriated the colonists. So Pontiac Rebellion was a big deal, because that along with the British debt would cover the stepping stones to the revolution. Good old Pontiac. So another one. Yes.
The bus and the elastic columns.
Okay, the Bank of the United States, and Hamilton wanted the federal government to charter, which is a contract, for a Bank of the United States that would collect government receipts, so collect government tax revenues, and issue currency. And also loan money for other banks. So by issuing currency and loan money for other banks, Hamilton wanted to create a stable financial system and a banking system that could loan money. But two things. The Republicans, so Jefferson and Madison, they opposed it because, as they saw it, first off, these banks would only help the very wealthy merchant class and not farmers. The ones who would get the loans is being direct aid for the merchants. And secondly, the Constitution does not allow for it. But Hamilton responded, it's in that necessary and proper or elastic clause. Since the government can print currency and the government can borrow and loan money and tax, it's implied under the elastic clause. That's that elastic clause, the necessary and proper clause, which will go on. We should have, if you turn the page to the Marshall Court and find McCulloch versus Maryland. McCulloch versus Maryland says that the Supreme Court, or that banks can be created, and it is an implied power. So that's a big one. That's implied power. Is there any others? What's that? Okay, Gibbons versus Ogden. That's another one of the cases, and for that one, the big thing you need to know is that it says that government can regulate interstate commerce. The government does have the power to regulate interstate commerce. And that's a really important case, because what that means is the government has to regulate interstate commerce. All the things like from pollution laws to banking to child labor laws, minimum wage, the government can do that because of interstate commerce. That's a huge one. And in fact, if we're going to do quick to the Marshall Court, just so we know the Marshall Court, that was a very nationalistic, pro-central government court. John Marshall was a Federalist appointed by Madison. In fact, when we had Section 5, is it we in 4? Want to ask me any questions on Section 4? I'll be glad to answer them. Yes. Say it again. Okay, Antebellum reforms, those are the reforms before the Civil War. And they put in a lot of things, and sometimes I have a few of those in there already. In fact, I jot down the big ones you might need to know. But the first thing you do need, they're all related to the Industrial Revolution. By the just the huge changes because of the Industrial Revolution. But for example, one reaction was the Transcendentalist Movement, with this idea to transcend this empirical society and go to, the idea is to get away and get back to nature. This was a very romantic, kind of conservative reaction, and it's best known by, probably the one we need to know is Henry David Thoreau, who wrote right on civil disobedience, which of course would have great influence on Gandhi, but especially to our point of view, Martin Luther King. Another one would be, now I did not write that down here, but the abolitionist movement, and we have the abolitionist movement down below. So that is an antebellum reform, but that's on there. But the next one, prohibition. And prohibition fits in with the Industrial Revolution with the idea that people drank so much. The idea was that it would not only make for better workers, but if families now rely upon a wage and the wage earner drinks all the alcohol, it hurts the families. And so this would be tied in with the Protestant work ethic of no drinking, punctuality and hard work. The next one on there,
Where's prohibition?
prohibition, just one of the antebellum reform.
Okay.
But eventually they will succeed and we'll get the 18th Amendment. The next one down, religion. And the big thing about religion, that would be the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening and this really big reaction to the Industrial Revolution and changes religion. And you notice that the Second Great, I have that down below separately, but I'm just trying to show how they're tied in together. Another one I put down there was jail. And there was a real big movement to do something about prison reform and to make punishment standardized instead of just very random. And so, you know, we have this system today where like, if you get arrested, you can serve like 10 to 15 years for a crime. You get what I mean? All that came out as a major reform to the system. The idea being, let's just not arbitrarily punish. It's arguable that's good. I say good and bad elements. And then women's suffrage. And I put that down with the women's rights movement that also fit under that. So the whole point about, I put those down as I want you to think about antebellum reforms, and they're tied to a bunch of different things, all related to the Industrial Revolution. 2 years ago, there was a short answer question about that, and everybody went to the reform. The review section did very well on it because they already wrote it down, then they reviewed it again. Yes. Yes.
The correct bargain.
So the correct bargain, that's right in the middle of the page, and that's when Adams defeated Jackson. And then the election, nobody got a majority electoral college, even though Jackson had more. But in the House of Representatives, Henry Clay, an Adams supporter, threw his support, he was Speaker of the House, threw his support to Adams. Adams won in the House of Representatives, and Clay became Secretary of State. Jackson's supporters said this was a corrupt bargain, and shows how corrupt Adams was. And this would be used to great effect in the election in 1820 or 1920. That'd be a shock. Still talking about Clay and Adams. So another one. Yeah.
Divide over capitalism through labor.
Okay, so is that near the bottom of the page? Where is that? And so the big issue about capitalism was very divisive. It was created this new system, you know, whether or not wage system, but also a very dynamic system with all this incentive to create. But people who looked at capitalism and were opposed to it, they felt left out. They said capitalism was creating wage slavery. Oh, that's right next to it. Okay. Capitalism creating wage slavery. Oh, I see what I did. Divide or free labor. See what I did? I thought that was creating. So they're opposed. They feel left out. And the issue is for wage slavery. Now I'm stuck on wage slavery. I should have free labor first, I'm sorry. Wage slavery, they felt that because wages are no longer decided by skill or how hard you work, that they are going to be, by definition, lower, and they will be stuck in a cycle of poverty and not able to get out of this system. They believe that wage slavery, they'll be stuck, can't get out. And therefore, they'll never have enough to get a different job, to move up. This system was trapping them as wage slaves. And wage slavery then will be used right before the Civil War as a way to attack the North. See, in the North, they're creating a bunch of wage slaves. We treat our slaves better. I know, that's a horrible thing to say, but it's also very elitist. Free labor, look at it much differently. You're not stuck in the job you don't want. Capitalism has created this dynamic system where if you work hard, show initiative, and a little bit of luck, maybe someday you can own a factory, or you can change the jobs. Free labor meant that they thought capitalism was opening up opportunities. So they looked at it as, this is a dynamic system. What we should have with free labor. And you know what? If you don't succeed in your job that you're stuck in, it's your fault. Because the system is so dynamic, anyone can succeed. This will be used by Northern Republicans before the Civil War to say, look, our system's better. Don't you want free labor instead of chattel slavery? Who can really run fast? I'm looking for somebody who thank you for volunteering. You know, Rob, sort of just kick the block out. Kind of push it in so that really people. Take what you want. Is there another one? Should I wait? Huh? Yeah, you should probably wait, but I'm still gonna ask. Good for you. Oh, Dartmouth versus Woodward. That's another court case. Any others? I'll wait till she gets that. Actually, I'll look and see if she doesn't have it, so I really should wait. That would be really nice. So Dartmouth versus Woodward. What if she got caught? Maybe someone busted her. Did she get busted?
No.
Okay, they all wanted me to answer Dartmouth versus Woodward without you, but I didn't.
Thanks.
Dartmouth versus Woodward. That said the idea that contracts affirmed the sanctity of contracts. That contracts will be protected by the government, and therefore it said that contracts, or therefore that the government will be on the side of whoever wrote the contract. And every business transaction, there's a contract. Another word is charter. It's written by two entities. One has power and one doesn't. So the contracts always favor who? Always. Because who writes it? Whoever has power writes the contract. So what it's saying is government's on the side of the power. This is a big deal. This will start to go out of favor in the 1950s and 60s and 70s, but it's back. Is there another one? Yes. So Eli Whitney, is that on page? Okay, the second column on that page 4. Eli Whitney, he didn't invent interchangeable parts, but the big thing was he was the first one to really market it, and this where they had machines called machine tools making the individual pieces instead of skilled craftsmen. Machine tools making this. And this would be a revolutionary change. He did it with muskets first. Because machine tools can make more standardized parts and make it faster and more efficient than one person. Machine tools would be revolutionary. In fact, it was so revolutionary that by the 1850s, they called it the American system of industry. Interchangeable parts. And therefore, whomever has the machines will have a huge competitive advantage over other competitors. And since machines are so expensive, by the way, what do we call machines? They're what? That's capital. And that leads directly to economies of scale. If you have the machines by economies of scale. Yeah. Bank War. Okay, so that was Andrew Jackson's fight against the rechartering of the Second Bank of the United States. And he would actually veto a rechartering bill of the Second Bank of the United States. In fact, a lot of people would see it as a fight between Andrew Jackson and the Democrats versus Nicholas Biddle and Henry Clay. Nicholas Biddle ran the bank and Clay wanted the bank. He was a Whig. It was part of his American system. And the big issue for the bank war is that Jackson felt there was too much power into the hands of a few corporate leaders like Nicholas Biddle, who could make or break the economy for their own personal gain. So he wanted to break up the banks because he thought there was too much power in the hands of a few. That was his reason. And he would be proven to be right. In response to the veto, Biddle actually cut back on the money supply, and that would help trigger the Panic of 1837. Now, the problem with Jackson's argument is he had no idea what to do with that. But what he did is he took government receipts that were supposed to go to the bank, he put them into state banks that he liked, called pet banks. And the pet banks started making loans that would fuel land speculation. And if you look down below where it has the Panic of 1837, part of the reason for the Panic of 1837 was there was a bubble in land prices. And when they tried to stop the bubble with what's called the specie circular, the bubble burst. And that would help trigger the panic. First real economic panic of the Industrial Revolution. Like, wow, the bus can be bad at this. And more people will be affected than ever before. Any others? And I know you're going through, like, you remember, like, college domesticity. You remember those things. Right, yeah.
Growth of parties, Democrats.
Okay, so I have growth of parties, I have Democrats and the Whigs. So I have both parties. You want both of them or just the Whigs? You know the Whigs by heart, right? So, the Democrats, and that's the start with the party of Andrew Jackson. But the big thing about the Democrats were that they believed that they were the party of the common man. Not average, just common as in not of some elite or wealthy birth. And their big thing is they wanted a greater voice of the people, aka democracy, meaning that the people are ultimately sovereign. They have with the vote. It's not a true democracy. But when people say democracy today, they're using the Jacksonian definition of it. And they feared the concentration of wealth into the hands of just a few capitalists. And so they mostly believed in the idea of wage slavery. And that's why they feared the bank. They were and they also greatly feared debt, as they saw that as a way that people could be controlled through debt by having to pay it back, and that's why they wanted things like to get rid of the bank. And their whole goal was to promote the lives of average people. And that's why the big issues of the Jacksonian era, you look right above, the bank war, the nullification tariff, and Indian removal, to his point of view, were to help the common man. Now, of course, his definition of the common man meant what kind of man? No, he didn't. Not necessarily slave owner, but white man. In fact, the part of the reason for nullification was because he saw that as a way of elite Southern plantation owners of controlling the common man by nullification. So the Whigs, want to do the Whigs in real quick? The Whigs were the opposition. They took the traditional British name for opposition party. But the Whigs, their biggest thing that tied them together were that they hated the democracy. They believed that the elite should control. And at first they did everything they could to keep people from voting. And then they finally realized they were sunk that way. And for the most part, they wanted government support for big business, and that's why they wanted Henry Clay's American system. Do I have Clay's American system on there? I don't have it? I thought I did.
It's on page 3.
It's on page 3. That Clay's American system was its very nationalistic government approach for, he wanted the bank, tariffs, and internal improvements. Remember, internal improvements are like infrastructure today, or public works in the Great Depression. So they wanted an active government to promote Clay's American system. But they were divided because Southern Whigs, they just didn't want the democracy, so rich plantation owners could run the South. And so the only thing that tied Northern and Southern Whigs together was their hatred of democracy. The issue of slavery would blow them up in the camps in Nebraska.
Wait, so what did the Southern Whigs believe?
Just they hated democracy. They wanted the elite to control.
Okay.
They wanted some tariff on things like sugar and tobacco, but that's about it. Any others? The era of good feelings, that's 1820, or I'm sorry, 1816, 1824. And there's this basic idea that there's only one political party. Only one political party, the Republicans. It hid all the big issues in between. But it seemed for a short time to go back to Madison's ideals in Federalist Number 10 and Washington's farewell address. We'll all get along together. But it hit problems like what's going to come up with the corrupt bargain and different sort of compromise. So now,
Did you see any use for your?
Hmm?
Did you see any use?
1816, 1824, Monroe's presidency. In fact, Monroe was elected, got all but one electoral votes in 1820. Is there another?
Jefferson's philosophy.
Okay, Jefferson's philosophy on page 3. And Jefferson's philosophy, first off, it wasn't significantly different than the Federalists. So there's a real fear the Federalists do is going to blow everything up. It's not significantly different. But his philosophy was the idea of support of the common man, and so Jacksonian Democrats definitely feel they're part of that. Agrarian, and he was the idea of yeoman farmers, independent farmers are the only way to be truly free. You're not dependent upon a job. So because of that, they feared industry, meaning they would have feared wage slavery, even though that would have been brand new. Next, they were frugal. He was terrified of long-term debt. Partially because he thought it would all go to the very wealthy. Next, expansion westward. He was constantly wanting to go expand westward. That's because of his plantation owner and farming. That would be like Louisiana Purchase would be a key element of that. And he was very, he believed, at least until he was president, a strict interpretation of the Constitution. And then lastly, pragmatic. Pragmatic, even though he said he's for a strict interpretation, we have such things as Louisiana Purchase and the Barbary Pirates War, right, went against it. So the big thing is pragmatic, and very practical. Is there another one? Oh, we're getting a lot. Yeah, go ahead.
The Treaty of Ghent.
The Treaty of Ghent, that ended the War of 1812 as a status quo antebellum, meaning the Treaty of Ghent achieved nothing, or the Treaty of Ghent said the war achieved nothing. Go back to the way it was before the war. But it ended at such a time to make the United States feel like they won the War of 1812. So it really fit into this kind of nationalistic movement. The United States is great. This is our continent. We won. We're Americans. Embargo Act. Okay, the Embargo Act would be passed. That would be by during the Jefferson administration in 1807, and it was because American ships were being stopped by the British blockade, and the Embargo Act meant the U.S. would trade with nobody. But the U.S. would trade with nobody. But it failed miserably. The economy did badly, and Jefferson, and this would really hurt Jefferson's popularity, would not have run for office, and so they would try to find something else afterwards. Is there another one? Yeah.
War of 1812.
Just real quick about the War of 1812. The three big reasons for the War of 1812 was neutrality rights, that the British and the French were stopping American ships. Land, the United States wanted expansion into more open expansion to the West and Canada. The U.S. thought they could get Canada. And security along the frontier. The United States blamed the British for Tecumseh's Confederacy and the Battle of Tippecanoe. And so they basically, this was partial to wipe out the Indian threat, at least east of the Mississippi River. And the United States was totally unprepared for this war. And in fact, they barely won the war. Or I'm sorry, barely survived the war. The U.S. Army did poorly. But including having the US Capitol get burnt down by the British. But the United States did win the last battle of the war, the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, ironically after the treaty was signed, and gave the United States the feeling they won the war. Gave the US the feeling. And so, the big thing about the War of 1812 is it would help trigger things like the Industrial Revolution. And that's when Americans, after this, in Tippecanoe, start calling ourselves Americans. It's our continent. Also helped trigger the Transportation Revolution. And we survived. We won. It was so important, the idea that the United States survived another war with Britain, and so some people call it the Second War of Independence. Any others? Yes.
Hartford Convention.
Hartford Convention will be done, that would be in 1814 by New England Federalists, and they talked about nullifying the war. They hated the war so much. But before it could actually be enacted, the war ended. But it gave the Federalists this stigma that they were not loyal to the country. We've added a lot in number 4. Where does 4 end? We'll add number 5 to there too if you have any questions from that. I'll go a little bit more, then let's take a break. Sound good? Yeah.
Can we go to conscription?
Is that on page
That's
7?
on page 5.
Page 5. So it's New York conscription. So both the North and the South did. Okay, we got on page 5. But the United States passed the Conscription Act, and it greatly favored the wealthy. They could hire a substitute or pay to get out of it. And anger over the draft would lead to a series of riots, but the biggest would be right after the Battle of Gettysburg, the New York draft riots. And it would basically be the poor working class, a lot of them Irish immigrants in New York, angry at the wealthy, but also angry at blacks in New York that, as they saw it, were the reasons of Reconstruction and conscripted, and they didn't want blacks coming north to compete with their jobs. And we don't know exactly how many people would be killed over those 4 days. You know, like the video we saw said 150, but I've seen figures as high as well over 1,000. But it's one of the bloodiest class conflicts in history, in American history, the New York draft riots, right in the middle of the war. And so it showed this class issue. And by the way, that the Irish immigrants, isn't that the same kind of thinking we've talked about with Little Rock Central High and so many other things? I'm thinking it comes back time after time. Boy, is it insidious. So another one. Yes.
Black soldiers and
And so after the Emancipation Proclamation took effect in 1863, the United States started actively recruiting black soldiers at lower pay, but they would eventually make up 1/10 of the entire United States Army and be decisive for American victory and infuriate Southerners. And the 54th Massachusetts was the first all-black regiment to be actively involved in combat. And even though they lost a battle at a place called Fort Wagner, they fought with great bravery like most of the rest of the Union soldiers, and so showed that black soldiers, guarantee that black soldiers can fight just like white. The big thing about black soldiers too, once they're going to be allowed to fight, you can no longer deny that blacks can't be citizens. You can see a direct line from black soldiers to the 14th Amendment, like a direct, straight line. Is there another one? Yeah, anything. So Indian removal, that's on page 4. And that was part of Jackson's idea to open up land for white farmers. But Indian removal would be, and then go back to Jefferson, with the idea that Indians should remove from their plots in like for example, in the American Southwest, which is in like Alabama and Mississippi, had moved across the Mississippi River to Indian Territory. And Congress would sign the Indian Removal Act to set up what is now Oklahoma as territory. And most Southwestern tribes saw the inevitable, and they would move, not willingly, but they would move. The Cherokees resisted, and there'd be a couple different court cases, but the most important is Cherokee versus Georgia, where it said that Cherokee law was sovereign inside the Cherokee Nation because they signed a treaty. But the Jackson administration said that has no effect on state law, and they didn't enforce it. And so eventually the Cherokees would be forcibly removed. And in 1837, the Cherokees would be removed, and it was just a combination of negligence and incompetence, but a third would die on the route called the Trail of Tears in 1837. And the negligence was outright just racist, horrific negligence. No. Yes.
Dixiecrat governments.
So that's on page 6? So close. So Dixiecrat governments were created right after the Civil War during presidential Reconstruction. During presidential Reconstruction. And basically their former Confederates allowed to come back into power right away. So the former Confederates came back in power immediately. And they would pass the black codes. So where do I have that Dixiecrat government? Yeah. I don't think I put black codes in here, did I? Not the black codes for this new government. Yeah, so the black codes here basically restricted the rights of the freed slaves. So they were not freedmen, but they had virtually no rights to leave their plantations or anything else. And these Dixiecrat governments then, this would help trigger radical or congressional Reconstruction. And you hear the Dixiecrats sometimes after Reconstruction ending, the Redeemer governments will be called Dixiecrats. And then remember in 1848, Strom Thurmond, he would call his party the Dixiecrats. And then everyone's when the Dixiecrats kind of pop back into the Democratic Party would be kind of destroying the South. So another one. Yes.
Presidential Reconstruction.
So that's in the bottom of page 5. And presidential Reconstruction, it very loosely followed Lincoln's wartime 10% plan, that if 10% of the people pledged oath, the state would be allowed back into the Union. But this was a wartime measure. And President Johnson latched onto this, that if any state did 10%, they could be allowed back in the Union with and get amnesty. Basically just allowed them to not be tried for anything they did. And so this would allow for the Dixiecrat governments and virtually no rights for the freedmen. And that's where you get the former vice president of the Confederacy being elected to his old seat in Georgia, just kind of showing up in the fall of 1865, expecting to be seated. And this would infuriate the Republican Party that fought so hard for equal rights, but then also in the United States. So another one. Yeah.
Antietam and the Emancipation Proclamation.
Okay, the big thing about Antietam was, this is where the Union Army beat back an invasion in 1862 by the Confederates. And General McClellan blew a number of opportunities to win the war right there. But it was enough of a victory for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all slaves in territories controlled by the Confederacy. It didn't end slavery, but it made sure that slavery would eventually be over. Politically, slavery's dead once you end it there.
Why did he need such a big victory to issue the Emancipation?
If you issue an Emancipation Proclamation, like let's say after a defeat, it makes it look like he's desperate. And he was terrified that if he looked desperate, he looked weak, especially the election of 1862 coming up. Also, it made sure Britain would never enter the war. When Britain entered the war, the Confederacy really had, be much harder. If Britain went into the war, they would have won. So another one. Yes.
The natives and Republican Party.
And that's near the top. The natives were anti-immigrant party, and they were anti-immigrant partially because of anti-Catholicism. The anti-papists and this weird religion will come in that they're not really loyal to the United States. And that goes back a long ways for religious wars. But also fear that they would take jobs away. And in the short run, in limited areas, immigrants can affect the job market. In the long run, they actually increase it dramatically, but that's another story. But also just, they're Americans. They don't want these foreigners coming in. And so clever politicians would take advantage of that prejudice to form eventually the Know-Nothing Party that would look like they had a chance to become the new party to take over for the Whigs in 1856, and did very well in the election of 1856. In fact, shockingly well in that election. But eventually they'd be rolled up into the Republican Party, mostly, that native establishment. Is there another one? Yeah. Dred Scott's in 1857. There's a Supreme Court ruling that Justice Taney, remember T-A-N-E-Y, Taney thought he'd solved the whole problem with one decision. And he said, the big problem was slavery in the territories. So what they said is, if slavery in the territories is the issue, slavery in the territories, and that sectional divide caused by that, let's just throw all that out by saying that slaves are property. You can take your property anywhere. And if you can take your property anywhere, that means federal laws against property, or federal laws against slavery, are violating the Constitution because you can take your property anywhere. So any federal law, so it threw out the Missouri Compromise, it threw out elements of the Compromise of 1850, even the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. But what the Dred Scott did is, it was so divisive that it infuriated the North. And that would lead to strengthening the Republican Party. And it infuriated the South that the North was found. Dred Scott was really divisive. That's one of the most important single issue that would show that sectional divide for the Civil War. Another one. Two more. Yeah. Go.
Wilmot.
The Wilmot Proviso was done during the Mexican-American War, and it said that any land taken from Mexico will be free soil. Free soil in any Mexican cession. It passed the House, didn't pass the Senate. And so Wilmot would be the most divisive issue in the events leading up to the election of 1848 and 1850. North and South. And eventually that would lead to the Compromise of 1850. Wilmot. That's all they could talk about. Last one in this section.
Wait, so Mexican session won't have slavery?
That's what it said, but it passed the House, didn't pass the Senate.
Okay.
So eventually that would be the Compromise of 1850 where they do popular sovereignty. Last one. Yes. So the Republican Party and Free Soil, is that on that? And they would be created out of the Republican Party out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And they were anti-slavery, or something that's called conscience Whigs, and Free Soil Democrats. And Free Soil Democrats would form this party. And the Republicans' main element was that they were free soil. And most abolitionists would join that party, even though there weren't very many abolitionists. The Republican Party was free soil. But they were also really embraced the very idealistic version of free labor. That we could create this system and spread it out where everybody would have the opportunity to succeed in this new capitalistic system. They weren't quite the 100% pro-business party, but they embraced that free soil party. And to Democrats in the South, that free soil was enough to convince them that they are going to destroy slavery in their way of life. Eventually, the idea would be they're all a bunch of John Browns. So let's take a quick break, and I'll come back and answer more. How many did we cover? 6? All pretty much like what I said. Hopefully it's good review. So you go out and get a drink or whatever, or stay here. Oh, I gotta run upstairs. I'll be right back. Does anyone else not have that periods and events? I gave this on Thursday. Are you recording these? That one you probably already know. I hope when you went through it, you're looking back. I know that. No one else? Okay, I gotta run upstairs very quickly. I do have to check the score of the Portland-Denver game. I don't know. I kind of. Portland's up by 5. I did watch the entire Portland-Denver game. Anybody else watch that? 4 overtimes.
I thought that's cool.
Center went 65.
Baseball team.
So terrible.
Today of the orchestra concert, so I have to go back to school. I'm like, why? Every time I see this, you walk along the fence. Clean up their lab, taking on the trash.
Billions of dollars. I'm gonna steal all your stuff.
So it's in the trash and back. Normally on a day down like $20. But you're gonna see like none of the people or something. I used to go there. Mariah. Spell. Oh yeah. Mariah. She was very big. She was gonna close her knee. So like you were there until she did nothing. And then she my people she kept saying, there was one day where she was like, and then like, how can you report that? You can't put it on. You make the first thing I found out was that we were all and we had no more large cups, so that all the stuff that was in the line was all out the way. We don't have any more Angus high dogs. We're all out of the new roller bikes we got with We're all out of red vines, so there's this entire spot in the candy section that was just empty. And then, like, I got there, and there was stuff that just didn't have to be closed the night before. And Jessica showed up, and I was just so broke. I should have fired. Manager didn't get there till 6 o'clock. Like, the guy was opening boxes, and there's stuff out there for like 2 days. And called,
What's that?
I love Kevin to death. It's like, you're the inventory manager. We're running out of.
You've already tried to get me one before. Would you trust you?
Then our fire shit like wasn't working.
What now? What did you do?
So,
All right. So I have good news for all of you.
like I couldn't believe
Heck, we've covered a lot, so I guess that's enough for the good news. So I do have good news, though, is that Wednesday we have an assembly. So which means you will still have a practice test to do, but that will be Wednesday.
Oh, great.
I know.
Wait, so the money is like
And I'll be I made enough copies.
wait, good. What's happening?
Just
Oh,
we got 42 minutes. I bet you're going to get. My guess is, and don't worry, I made enough copies of it, so you'll be able to do it, and if you can take it home. That was my plan, and I got a couple of little things to give you. Yeah.
So I'll be gone that period because the money management.
Just I'll give you the practice sets. Sound good? Yeah, if you're gonna be gone, just whatever. All right, so let's go ahead then and keep going. I will continue to review. There's a lot of stuff. In fact, if you want to do the, we can add the next section to it too. So we'll keep going to that next section. But let's stop at period 7. Yeah, let's stop at period 7 for now. Yeah.
Horizontal trust.
Horizontal trust and vertical trust, and that's on page 7. Am I right?
Where?
It's about 3/4 of the way on the 4th column. Where's it at? Halfway in the middle. Okay. So the thing about horizontal and vertical, those were 2 examples of monopolies. Remember, trusts are synonymous with the monopolies. And horizontal trust is this idea of a company owning all the like industries, owning all the like ones. So the best example would be John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil, where they controlled about 98% of the oil refineries in 1900. And when we think of monopoly, that's what we normally think of, horizontal trust. Vertical trust, that's owning all the means of production. So like Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Steel, they own the coal and iron mines, they control the railroads, they control the steel mill, and they control the distribution. So you go from bottom up. That's vertical. Horizontals are all alike. And that's another example of economies of scale. You know, the bigger will have a competitive advantage and having the power of monopoly. And when you do that, you can do a couple different things, but you can charge higher prices if you have a monopoly, but at the same time, you can drive wages down. Monopolies drive wages down. So no. Yes.
Homestead Act,
1862, the Homestead Act, where's that on? Page 6? Yeah. Oh, okay, that would set up the system where settlers will get 160 acres of government land as long as they settled it for 20 years. And the idea was to promote small farmers. It didn't quite work that way. Speculators would scoop it up. And the big thing about the Homestead Act, or the two big things, first off, it totally disregarded American Indian lands. But the second one, 160 acres wasn't enough in the West. They'd even double it. It just wasn't enough to start a farm. Almost all the homesteaders were there. Is there another one? Yeah.
Agrarian problems and agrarian problems.
Page 7? Only page 7. That's not page 7. Agrarian problems, and the big thing about agrarian problems, where they all revolve around debt. So they all revolve around debt. And so the agrarian problems were overproduction, and that was caused by not only more land, but mechanization. Mechanization meant that you could produce more with fewer people.
Can you repeat that first one again? Sorry.
Overproduction and mechanization, they all revolve around debt. All come back to debt. So overproduction drives prices down, so they can't pay back their debt. The next were like the railroad monopolies. The railroad monopolies would control prices and charge more for small loads, and so they were basically slaves to the railroads and these railroad monopolies. The next, they opposed the gold standard. The gold standard created a system like deflation, so that kept prices down. They couldn't pay back their debt. The next was high tariffs. High tariffs raised prices, and farmers didn't produce goods. And I said deflation, didn't I? And so the big thing about that one is, so farmers, with deflation, they may say want inflation, I guess is what I meant to say. So they want inflation. And all those made the situation of debt worse. And the big thing is that farmers begin to realize that there's no political party who's helping their interests. And that would lead directly to the populist party. Is there another one? Oh, wow, that's convenient. The Populist Party, which is just below that. So the Populist Party would be made up mostly of farmers and also miners, and also remnants of things like the Knights of Labor Party, and also the Prohibition Party. But in Omaha in 1892, they met and laid out their platform. And their platform was really pushed this idea of social morality, that society has a responsibility to protect the rest of society. You can't do whatever you want for profit. So the idea of social morality. And they wanted to do that with things like creating inflation through free silver. They also wanted a progressive income tax that would raise wages. They also wanted they were free traders, wanted lower tariffs. They also wanted direct election of senators. They even talked about government ownership of some, or at least control of some key industries. And so they were economically more liberal. And the Populist Party would help lead to, eventually, they would be the roots of the progressives and then the New Deal in a lot of ways. Oh, I almost forgot. But they never were able to appeal to urban voters. They could never appeal that there's too many cultural differences. Okay, is there another one? Yes. So the big thing about immigration, in this context, would be the immigration after about 1880, and the significant numbers of this new immigration would be from Eastern Europe and from Southern Europe. And so what that meant is culturally much different than the previous immigration. Either different religion, or for that matter, just different cultural indicators like food and clothing, so they were different. And so many immigrants, when they came into the United States, there were no restrictions on immigrants, at least for much of that time, from Europe at least, and they would go through Ellis Island. Ellis Island would be a place where immigrants would be have to pass a quick physical, and a little bit of their history recorded. And so Ellis Island would be a significant number of immigrants. In my past, there's a couple immigrants that came before Ellis Island, but a couple came in the Ellis Island area. And this would help lead to a growth of nativism. Anti-immigrant feelings, and you can see the beginnings of concepts like social Darwinism and eugenics. We don't want to don't want to have race mixing. Don't want to have race mixing. Okay, is there another one? Yes. The Dawes Act, and that's on page 6.
Yeah.
The Dawes Act in 1887, and the plan there was to turn American Indians on reservations into small white farmers. And they would get a homestead if they gave up their tribal allegiance. They'd get a homestead. But what happened, the result, was an absolute disaster for American Indians. This opened up land for white farmers to come in and take good reservation land. And the end result would be that half of all land on reservations today are owned by non-reservation members. And this is part of the reason for the bad economy and the high poverty rates on reservations. But this was seen as a reform. We will help them become white farmers. And it was a terrible policy. 1887. And you could tie that in with the Burke Act, which also forced reservation children to go to brutal schools to learn how to become white. They kind of go hand in hand. And that would lead to another cultural disaster. Is there another one? Yes.
ICC/Interstate Commerce Act.
Do I have the Granger laws on there? I thought about it.
Did you put the Burke Act?
I didn't put the Burke Act, I should have. Okay, so the ICC came about when the Granger laws were thrown out of the Supreme Court. They only were state level laws to regulate railroad rates. So the ICC was to regulate railroad rates. And the government could do it because of interstate commerce. And this we passed in 1887 too. And it created the Interstate Commerce Commission, the ICC, to regulate rates, but it would soon, two big problems. It would be filled with railroad men, so they would have no real regulate, or they wouldn't really regulate. And secondly, they didn't give them clear powers to regulate, so it had no real powers. And so because of this, the ICC did not do what was promised, thus convincing farmers we need something like our own part of the populace to regulate railroad rates. So that would lead directly to the populace. And you can tie that with the Sherman Antitrust Act too. Is there another one?
Is the ICC still functioning?
Not anymore. It's now called the Overland Transport Commission. And they regulate, but since they do nothing about monopolies, they really don't regulate. They're kind of a non-entity. Yeah.
Total war and
So the eventual way the United States would defeat the Plains Indians was they would bring the ideas of total war. And the idea of total war is they would destroy the way American Indians could survive by killing the buffalo and then forcing them to go onto reservations. So using those actions. And it's no coincidence that the head of the army during most of that time would be William Tecumseh Sherman, the guy who did the March to the Sea. So it's basically from the 1870s and 80s to force on reservations. Is there another one? Yeah. So Gilded Age politics, which is a little bit below, the big thing on that one was a marriage between business and politics, where business interests really ran the political systems in both political parties, and where big money dominated politics. And because of this Gilded Age politics, that both parties were supporting big business, eventually, and they supported laissez-faire economics. That would lead to eventually the idea we need the populist and the progressive party. So the big thing about Gilded Age politics, money and business, and so pushing things like tariff and gold standard and things like that. Is there another one?
Business cycle.
The business cycle on page no, bottom.
Yeah, it's a good.
Oh, okay. The business cycle is endemic in capitalism, and the thing about the business cycle is when there is a boom, it always leads to overproduction, and overproduction will begin to lower prices. And to get out of debt, it always leads to more production, and then eventually cutbacks. And the big thing about cutbacks, that's when you start firing workers, and demand drops. And when demand drops, prices drop even more, and that's where you get that deflationary curve. I talk about that deflationary curve. And usually the biggest part about this, when it hits into a bust, is when you have a bank panic. When banks don't get their money back, and they panic. And so a bust, bad economic times, and people kind of lose faith in the system, and it needs something to trigger demand going up. And usually in history, it's been some kind of government action, like railroads in the 1870s and 1890s, public works in the 1930s, all the way up to your depression and government stimulus in 2009. And eventually, somebody gets demand up, and eventually we hire more workers, and prices begin to go up, and that's what's called the inflationary. That's the boom bust cycle. And the thing is, it's endemic in capitalism. So the big thing about liberal or conservative economics, the big thing is they claim to have a way to get out, to avoid bust, and then to avoid a bust, and then get out of a bust if it does happen. We can argue about the effectiveness of each. Yeah.
So laissez-faire economics?
So laissez-faire economics, that's another term what would eventually be called conservative economics. And laissez-faire means big, or basically government aid, direct and indirect government aid for big business. So things like the gold standard and high tariffs, troops to put down labor unions, allowing for monopoly, so no regulation. That's laissez-faire. So big up for business, but at the same time, no interference in competition. No interference in competition. So help big business and then let them compete with prices and products and wages any way they want. And because of economies of scale, that will help them. There's another one. Yeah.
Sherman Antitrust Act.
And that we passed in 1890, one of 3 laws, and the whole idea is the Sherman Antitrust Act would stop illegal restraint of trade. Illegal restraint of trade were what monopolies did. So it would break up monopolies. But it was written in such a way that it was impossible to enforce. So it did not do anything about monopolies, and that'll trigger the desire for the populace and then the progressive movement to regulate monopolies. And since we're all monopolies today, we see the impact of that all the time. So another one. We good? We're done? Yes. Coxey's armies in 1894, and that was during the terrible depression, the panic of 1893. And what it was is Jacob Coxey suggested that people should go march on Washington, D.C. to get government jobs. They would have paychecks, increase demand. And to many, that looked like it could be a revolution. Coxey's army would fail to get these government jobs, but it was shown in 1894 it looked like that neither party was willing to do anything, and that would help trigger the populace with a big election of 1896 and the populace. They're not. Oh, it seemed very much like the bonus army in 1932. Remember the bonus army? Is there another one?
Election 1896.
One of the most important elections in history. The Democrats would nominate William Jennings Bryan, and because he took the idea of free silver, which was inflation, the populists nominated Bryan too. The Republicans nominated William McKinley, who stood for the gold standard. And this election really became one of gold versus silver, or big business and stability of big business versus farmers and workers. But this election showed the importance of money and urban interests. Money and urban won. McKinley had 7 times the money as Bryan, and McKinley would win this election. But it also showed that there was a thirst for reform. It wasn't going to be the populists because they're gone, but it will help lead to the progressive movement and then the New Deal. I went fast over that, I know, but hopefully you remembered a little bit of that. Any others? Grant Mobilier? The Grant administration, even though the Grant administration, he tried to enforce Reconstruction, and so he wasn't like totally corrupt, but he delegated too much, and the Grant administration was known to be very pro-business. Very pro-business. And the best example of a scandal was called the Credit Mobilier scandal, where the Union Pacific basically created a company to build the Union Pacific Railroad using government loans to pay this company to build the railroad, and then bribe members of Congress with stock of the Credit Mobilier, so no one would really get involved in their scandal, their grift. That was the Credit Mobilier. The Knights of Labor was one of the two big labor unions at that time. The AFL was the other one of the 1870s, 1880s. And the Knights of Labor were going to be an industrial union, meaning a union of all workers. And what they hoped was that they would allow for all workers in, and that included workers who were not just white men, included people who were not white, and women. And their big thing was they were totally opposed to the wage system, and they wanted to create some kind of cooperative system where the workers had more control over industry. And many of the reforms of the populace, like an income tax and things such as that, come from the Knights of Labor. But they were seen as probably the biggest threat to business, and they would be destroyed when they were blamed for the Haymarket Affair in 1887. Because they were tied to dangerous radicals, and they would be known as, okay, not socialists because they weren't scary enough, but bomb-throwing anarchists. All right, good. Is there another one? Do you want to get to the last few and just couple from 7, or do you want to quit? You want to do a few more? I'll take a couple from 7 if you have that too. Because that's what you have. You were, except for the legacy of New Deal. Any other ones I'll take? I'll do a few more than I got to quit. Yeah. Say it again. Okay, that was after the United States got the Philippines in the Treaty of Paris of 1898. And what it was is the Filipinos thought the United States was going to liberate them. And instead they fought a guerrilla war against United States occupation under Emilio Aguinaldo. Remember that name now? Aguinaldo. And a horrible, bloody civil war where at least 200 to 300,000 Filipinos would die, many of them by American reprisals. Eventually, Aguinaldo would be captured, and that he agreed to help end the war, and the Philippines would get their independence in 1946. But this ended America's taste for colonialism and foreign wars. Horrible, bloody, awful thing. Well, the United States was on the side the British were back in the Revolutionary War. Legacy of the New Deal on page 9. Is that what you wanted? Okay, so the legacy of the New Deal, a couple things. First off, it set up the Great Depression. The Great Depression came out of that where the gap between the rich and the poor actually shrunk. And the gap of the Great Depression all the way up to the 1980s. Then it totally reversed. And now the gap is like as fast as it's ever been right now. The gap between the rich and poor is the biggest it's ever been in history. But another thing it did is it also set up that because of the Great Depression, Keynesian economics up until the late 1970s. Very Keynesian. It also set the idea, or created the idea, that the government is responsible, at least must meet the needs of the American people. That the government has a role of making, or whether they be for unemployment, or basically working conditions, or any number of things. More people than ever believe that. It also kind of set the idea of a democratic majority. This democratic majority that will go on to the late 1970s. Of urban voters, rural voters, African Americans, Catholics, immigrants. They call it the Roosevelt Coalition. And the last thing, it would, even though conservatives lost a lot of power, it would galvanize conservative opposition to the New Deal. That you can see from when Barry Goldwater, they finally got in. And then they would begin to chip away at it with Ronald Reagan in 19 through today. God, they can get rid of Social Security. They'd be so happy. Yes. Progressives, and that's on page 8. Well, a little bit of the roots from the Populist Party, but they're middle class reformers. And they're middle class reformers who benefit from capitalism, but they believe it has to be regulated or controlled. Their big thing about the progressives, they fear revolution. So we better regulate capitalism to save it. And so we already got they want regulation. They also believe they believe regulation can solve our problems. They also believe in experts, a trained professional class, technocrats, those kind of things that can solve the problems. They also believe that they believe in direct government action. Only government can solve these things. And at first there'd be local level progressives thought they could do it at the local level, but eventually they realized that it's going to require national level progressives because of the interstate commerce clause. And they would be both Republican and Democratic progressives. Yeah. So the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and that would be done 1904. And what it said is, it was added to the Monroe Doctrine. So it said that only the United States can intervene in Latin America. Only the US. The US will decide where it can intervene. Now, this Roosevelt just simply announced, that is my reading of the Monroe Doctrine. Europeans can't, and the US can intervene. And this would be the basis of big stick diplomacy and economic imperialism in Latin America, where the US would say, this is our hemisphere, and we will decide what to do. So this is just a pronouncement by the United States. Trust me, nobody else in Latin America agreed to this. They didn't have a choice. Yeah.
On the 18th Amendment.
So the 18th Amendment, that would be, if you look down, it's page 7. That's prohibition. And it started as a wartime measure. The idea of prohibition basically saved grain because we needed it for the war, so they stopped making beer, like beer and some other harder spirits. It turned into a wartime measure. You don't have the Germans, so prohibition to eventually the grand experiment to prohibit the sale of alcohol, and it would be enforced by the Volstead Act. I don't have the Volstead Act. Yeah, the Volstead Act. And what the Volstead Act did is that created a federal system to enforce prohibition by putting a huge tax on alcohol. And at first, it did dramatically drop drinking. In fact, consumption dropped on average by about 2/3, but organized crime exploded. You know, people wanted to buy it, now led to organized crime. So another one. How many more do you want to do? 2 more? Then I'm done. Yes.
Teller and Platinum.
Need a better one than that. No, Teller and Platinum, that's a really good one. And where's that one at? And the Teller Amendment was passed just as the Americans entered the Spanish-American War, and it said the U.S. would not would not annex Cuba. So we could say we're not fighting a war for conquest. But the other places the U.S. annexed weren't involved, like the Philippines or Guam or Puerto Rico. The Platt Amendment would be done 5 years later. I'm sorry, 4 years later, so 1902. And the Platt Amendment said that the United States can intervene anytime it wants in Cuban politics. Intervene to protect American interests, meaning United Fruit or coal or tin, not really coal, I'm sorry, tin or aluminum mines, bauxite mines, that sort of thing. And it said that Cuba can make no treaties with anybody else. And it would be this Platt Amendment, part of the reason why Castro would remain popular, even after he created a pretty bad totalitarian state. Oh, and it also gave the United States a naval base in Cuba that we just kept. What naval base? Guantanamo Bay. And it's because it was there on American shore, that's what we used as a prison after the September 11th attack. One more, make it a good one. No one has one? Okay. Yes. Trickle down economics. That's on page 8. Is it? Wow. You know, I only get good at the end. If trickle-down and supply side are the same thing, another term for conservative economics. And in the 1920s, it goes along with Andrew Mellon, who was the Secretary of the Treasury for all three Republican presidents, Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. And trickle-down economics is the whole concept that government, let's do whatever it can to put more money in the hands of the wealthy. More money in the hands of the wealthy. Through things like tax cuts, no regulation, anti-union, get money in their hands, and then they'll use that money ideally to build more factories, invest in factories. If you have factories, that will create, they'll need workers. And the workers then will increase demand. And so this concept, supply creates demand. You help the suppliers and it'll create demand. But there's a big problem. It leads to overproduction and it leads to speculation. Because if you give the wealth, give people who don't really need to spend money more money, it's hard to start a business. So they might invest in, remember, Florida real estate and then the stock market. And trickle-down economics would make a big revival in the late 70s, and it is the economic system of today. Supply side. And it works really well. Money is funneled to the wealth. Did we get a lot done? I hope that helped. So tomorrow I will go through all the 1990s and 2000s, and I will review other days, and then Wednesday at lunch. Got about half the people here. A lot of people didn't come. I have nothing but contempt for that. So yeah, I'm actually surprised. But you know, I'm not the one who has to take the test. So. Yeah.
I don't know how. I just want to course videos.
You know, they're very limited, but they have some good background. Because you know, jot things down.
Did I tell you about one of my
Not even
coworkers
difficult.
that course was on started World War II? No, I know, but she like is trying to get, you know,
Why are you,
like,
what are you putting on my
but
back?
she's like, Germany was like, we're gonna remilitarize Rhineland, and then France was like, no, and then they fought, and I was like, what if I like his baby Poland? And she was like,
Yes. What's that? Yeah, Wednesday. No, not as many people.
I have a US and it's really funny.
Oh, girl, I got plenty of those. Let me tell you.
Frederick, is that practice test you gave us on Thursday? That's due tomorrow.
No, I just gave it to you to do on your own.
Okay.
Just do it on your own time.
All right.
Thanks, Mr. Partridge. Surrender.
I hope it helped. We'll see you tomorrow.